All right, this is the second time I'm recording this, so maybe my intro will not be as long. So every week or so, I have a show with a Protestant pastor who happens to be a former philosophy professor of mine from my undergraduate studies at Cal State San Bernardino. And we've been doing this show for about 2 years now, since the beginning of 2021, I think it was actually March, April. Well, close to 2 years anyway. It started off with an interview on Roman Catholicism. Most of his congregation apparently are former Catholics, and they had a lot of questions about Catholicism. And so they interviewed me, and it was pretty, I guess, pretty popular, I guess, amongst this congregation. And also, we were also streaming that and promoting it in the Philippines. So in those days, we were getting, quite a few views from not just locally, but in the Philippines. But I don't think we are marketing it in the same way we used to. In any case, I think it's still valuable enough to continue this project. He comes up with a topic and usually tells me about 30 minutes beforehand, and it doesn't give me a chance really to prepare too much. And I said that I prefer it that way. So he's not trying to throw a curveball at me or anything like that. I do prefer not being prepared so much, because I might overthink it, over research it, and then all I would be doing is presenting a book report, and I don't want that to happen. That way, I think it's much more fun on my part to kind of react to the pastor's usually progressive perspective, and gives me a chance to defend a more conservative view, certainly from a Roman Catholic view, but also representing the more conservative Protestant views. And the pastor has also said on many occasions off screen that he has appreciated giving that perspective, because while he has had interactions with those who have more conservative theological, political views, perhaps their approach or their way of presenting their case is not as effective, I suppose, as I've been. So he said. I don't know. This is the claim that he's given, or he shared with me. So without further ado, what I'm going to play here is the tail end of our conversation 2 weeks ago on women's ordination, which is a very controversial topic, not in Christianity in general, but certainly within the Roman Catholic Church. Folks have been, and clerics and lay people have been trying to get women's ordination through for quite some time. This is not a recent thing, but certainly it comes up every so often, and a lot of them had hope that this pontificate would make that change, and it looks like Francis would not be making that change. He even says he doesn't have the authority to make that change. So I'm going to turn my camera off and play the rest of the video, and hope you enjoy it. Maybe learn something from it. And if you'd like to watch the whole video, you could go to Symposia Church on Facebook, and that would be the church that Dr. Fidel Arnecillo pastors in Ontario, California, currently at an Anglican or Episcopalian church in Ontario, a pretty historic one, actually. So you can look them up on your own. So without further ado, I will turn my camera off and enjoy the show.
Sure. Go ahead.
Actually, I agree with you. There's no. If Protestants view. Excuse me for a second. I want to make sure that when I shared the screen, that I am sharing the actual video with the audio. I wouldn't want to waste more time here. All right. Their services in the way I understand them to view their services, not a Catholic Mass, nothing to do with sacrifice. There's no biblical reason, in my opinion, Well, other than they're supposed to be styling in the churches. Depends on how you define churches from a Catholic perspective. So what I'm saying is, from a Catholic perspective, women's ordination for Protestants, whatever, have at it. They're not offering sacrifices. They're not offering the Catholic Mass. Mm-hmm. They reject the Mass. So if all they're doing is preaching in a barn, and there's literally a church close by called the Red Barn. So I'm not trying to be facetious. If they're literally just, and from a Catholic perspective, they're not actually Catholic churches, right? So they are congregations of Christians that come together, like where 2 or 3 are gathered, there I shall be, right? If it's that kind of setting, then women preaching in a non-church context, have at it. I'm not opposed to it. Now, some of my Catholic friends will still say, well, but if you say it's okay for them to do it, that it's going to plant a seed in Catholics. And well, Catholics have always been wanting to have women's ordination for centuries. This is not a new thing. People trying to get that going. It's just not going to happen because there's not enough gas in the tank for those movements to actually make it happen. It's just not going to happen. The hierarchy is the hierarchy, And so that's why you have Francis, where he has made some progressive statements in 2022, where he said the church, and he was talking about himself, he cannot change the teaching because there's a Petrine ministry, which is a ministerial kind of ministry in the church, and that's all male. He can't change that. Then he talks about the Marian ministry, which is kind of motherly and feminine, cultivating that kind of vocation for women to be the nurturers in the church. And then that could be any kind of ministry, really, just fill in the blanks of the feminine nurturing type ministries. And then he talks about administrative, which I think aligns to what you're trying to say. He's talking about there should be women in the church in leadership, even pastoral, if you will, but not ministerial in the sense of the Mass. They cannot become priests, but can they be the administrative pastor of the local parish? This is a very progressive diocese that I live in, San Bernardino, where the previous bishop would have priests at his parishes, but the technical pastor of the churches, oftentimes he would assign a nun, a woman, to be the pastor. They call them pastoral coordinators, right? So I know there's still that kind of distinction there. They were not pastors per se, but they basically did what pastors did. They had the powers of the pastor administratively. So can women do those jobs? Sure, fine. That they did that. It happens already. But can they be ordained as Catholic priests? No, it's not going to happen. So short answer is, if Protestants want to ordain women, have at it. No big deal from a Catholic perspective.
Yeah. No, but of course, I'm always, I think I'm still puzzled by the line of reasoning, right? Why women cannot be priests, right?
Well, we take the book of Hebrews. I just read it earlier.
Yeah. So. But I'm saying is that fails to understand that can also be right. Culturally conditioned claims, right? Given that the author of Hebrew, whoever that may be, right, is also very limited in what he can actually imagine about the priesthood, right? So
that's a claim. That's a legitimate objection, and they can make those arguments in the church councils or whatever it is they want to come and talk to the bishops or whatever. They have made those claims and they have made those arguments, and it falls flat. So.
So for me, I think the spirit of Protestantism, for me at least, is that traditions, right, can actually be questioned, right? Tradition or should be questioned, right? They don't necessarily need to be, ultimately normative values. Traditions can change. Even Jesus, opposed or challenged traditions of his own time, right? And so I think that this is supposed to be the part, and I think this is what makes me a progressivist, right? Sure. Because that is the part, I think, of how the spirit moves, right? How that you have to go with, this changes, right? This you have this tradition, it gets challenged, right? And then you get hopefully a better one, right? And then you just keep on constantly challenging it as the culture progresses, right? As knowledge progresses, right? So so I think and I think this might be for at least for traditional Catholics, right? Where tradition matters, right? And I think that's what you're arguing for, right? That's why when you look at Hebrews, right, it looks like there's a tradition there of what the priesthood is supposed to be, of the the maleness of the priesthood, right? That is that is important, right, for the Catholic Church, because the goal is to pass on this tradition from one generation to the next, right? And again, I understand that, but I just think that I don't think there are reasons today, right, that one can provide that will tell us that women cannot be priests or women cannot be pastors. I just I don't know. It might be justifiable in the past, right? Given that the quality of thinking and of women might be like very low, given that they're not really exposed to all sorts of different things, right? But now I think it's very different. Okay, women can be very, very smart. They can be they're not necessarily driven by their emotions, right? You might be able to say that generally, but we know that there are women who can be very, very rational, right? So my goal for having this podcast is to have this kind of conversation so that people will be aware, right, of these issues, right? And not just that, so that they can also think for themselves, given that I think this was a good discussion because it reflects the differences that we have based on the kind of Christian group where we actually belong. the different Christian groups where we belong, right? And so I don't think that that this reason why we're having this conversation is because I think it's about time that people should have a lot of this kind of conversations, right? Because we should have adequate data that will tell us whether women can really be priests, right, or not. So just like what you said a while ago, right? You don't have to be a priest to actually recite all of those rituals, right? Those liturgies, that reflect some kind of a sacrificial act, right? But I don't see why women can't do that. I don't know, right? I just can't see why. So the reasoning is seemingly they can't do that just because they're women, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but yeah, I would
just like I can't have a baby. That's just the way it is.
Yeah. But there's a difference between the two, though, right?
No, I mean, what I mean is there's an intention there in the design of how it's supposed to be. God could have certainly made us all asexual. He could have, but he didn't.
But
and there's got a reason why. And so if he created the priesthood for whatever reason, for whatever time, my claim is there's a reason why he made it an all-male priesthood. And that's just the way it is. I mean, you can make a claim that it's culturally conditioned, that's fine. But it could also still be that he intended it to be an all-male priesthood.
Yeah, but
it's at least possible.
But again, our conception of how it is designed, right, can be more like a reflection of power relations, right? The dynamics of power relations. So, for example,
you talked about NFL earlier. You talked about sports. There's a reason why even in today's age you don't have sex.
But again, we understand that because it looks like there's a clear difference, right, between the physical powers of men and women. But when it comes to ability to make sacrifices, right, preaching, leading,
that was very patriarchal of you to say, Pastor.
Yeah, which one?
What you just said. I mean, there are progressives that will say that they should allow women.
Yeah. But I mean, again, I think it's obvious, right, that we can't have that, right? Given that just look at the best player in the WNBA, right, and look at a much more like a mediocre, right, NBA player. We'll begin to see differences here, right? So, but the point I'm making.
So I don't want you to get canceled. So I'll tell.
Oh no, I'm okay. I'm okay with that. I'm okay about making that kind of claim because I think that's obvious. But what I'm disagreeing is that I think when you actually look at women and men, right, they can seem to actually do the work of the ministry, right? And I don't see why women should be prevented from ordination. But
that's what you're talking about, the work of the ministry. And from a Protestant ministry standpoint, there's nothing sacrificial about anything Protestant. There's nothing, right? But if the theology that I described earlier is correct, which talks about Christ being the bridegroom and the church being the bride, feminine, masculine complementarity, right? And then the priest is offering that same sacrifice that Christ offered, then it's appropriate and proper for that representative to be masculine and male, because he's representing the bridegroom. So it would be inappropriate from a Catholic theological perspective to have that be a feminine, because then the bridegroom is a female, and that'll get us into LGBTQ issues, right? And that's historically not, there's no complementarity there. Right?
But the imagery and the symbolism is clearly a reflection of a patriarchal society, though, right? That's why
that's what Christ intended, then that's what it is.
I don't know if that Christ intended that, right? Because that's
the Catholic perspective. Christ intended that.
So that's
what I'm saying.
Yeah, Christ's perspective. Then you look at the gospel. Jesus seemingly not very much concerned about gender, right? At least the gospel
for salvation, sure. He was concerned enough to only name male apostles,
because during that time, women are, because of the kind of, how they were actually positioned in the society, right? That's just not gonna happen. But there are probably,
he was concerned or he wasn't.
There are probably indications, though, that Jesus was opening up the way for women, right? By having, there are a lot of stories about women, right, in the Gospels. Jesus' encounter with women, right?
He was very revolutionary, right? One theory could be true. He could be planting the seed, and he knows that that's going to progress. The other theory is just as plausible from my view, which is, maybe the Jewish system was too restrictive, and he's opening the door for a little bit more for what women can do. He could also still be limiting it to a certain extent, right? He might be opening the door just a little bit, but still saying, you could do all these other things, just not that thing. Now you might not see that as convincing enough, but he was very, I agree, he was very revolutionary to whatever, to a certain extent, but I can only go with what information we have. And he opened it up to women deacons and all this other stuff, but it still says, don't preach in the church, don't teach men in the church, veil yourself in the church, those kind of things. And it's either something you follow or you don't. And the Catholic Church chose to continue that, at least up until recently, where women had to be veiled, right? And women couldn't teach in the church. But anyway, I think I'm just going, I'm going in circles at this point. But all I'm saying is, I can see why you're presenting an alternative view, and that makes sense. And I think that's viable from a Protestant theological perspective, I think. But it just can't be, it's just apples and oranges. You just can't apply that same reasoning to a Catholic perspective, because it's a priesthood. It's not just pastoring. It's not just preaching at a pulpit.
No, and like I said, I disagree with that, right? Given that I disagree with that position, right? That you're presenting.
Sure, of course you do. That's why you're Protestant.
Because
if you were Catholic, you'd probably you'd have to kind of at the very least consider the Catholic theological tradition of 2,000 years before you can give objections, right? You'd have to understand why it developed the way it did. But certainly from a Protestant perspective, I don't see why you couldn't have women pastors. You don't have a priesthood.
Or we are all priests according to Luther, right?
A priest in a certain sense, right? He rejected the sacrificial priesthood. That's why. He thought he reduced the 7 sacraments to just 2, marriage and baptism, right? So he didn't believe in the ministerial sacrificial mass. Now some Lutherans reclaimed, just like some Anglicans reclaimed, some of the theology of the mass. And that's why when I went to Missouri Synod here in Redlands 10 years ago, that service seemed more Catholic than my local Catholic church. The priest was facing the wall, as some people would say, right? Just like the Latin Mass, he was facing the wall, and there was incense, there was candles, there was a very different Lutheran than your Lutheran Pietistic.
I didn't know that the Lutheran Missouri Synod is liturgical like that.
Very liturgical.
So.
And they call themselves Father, right? They're called. Oh, actually, no. I called him Father, and he almost slapped me. So he didn't want to be called Father. But everything else smells and bells. It looked like Catholic Church. I didn't know that. I should check out Missouri Synod, right, and see. I'll go with you. The one in Redlands. There's a Missouri Synod. First Lutheran. That's what they call it.
So I think we had a good discussion here. It pretty much reflects the differences between you and me when it comes to this matter, right? And for those of you who watch us, this is a time for you to, just probably think and reflect about your own views about this matter. I think this is going to be an important issue, right? Another important issue that will, as history unfolds, right? And let's just hope that the Roman Catholic Church will be open to women priests. I'm just kidding.
Never.
So,
No, it was actually defined infallibly.
uh-huh.
So it's going to be very hard for a future pope to change it.
Yeah.
Yeah, anyway, that's just
Yeah,
adding
that's fine.
details there.
So again, thank you for watching us. I thank Laurence for being a good conversation partner, right? Very smart, very sensible, and very witty. And you can think really fast too, so that's very good, right? So again, thank you. I don't know if you want to say something, Laurence, before I finish.
No, this is always interesting topics. I really sometimes I get nervous. You tell me like 30 minutes before our program, but we're talking about this.
Because I know you're always ready.
you had a sermon written. You've been thinking about it for a week, but then you give me 30 minutes to think about it. I actually prefer it because I think I would overthink it.
Yeah. And you're the one who told me that you will overthink it if I announce ahead of time. Right?
Yeah, no, it's fine. It's good. It keeps me on my toes.
Yeah, so that's good. So again, thank you for watching us. God bless you guys.
All right, just to summarize, so the Catholic Church does not ordain women. In my presentation or my argument here in the beginning of the video that I didn't really show is that there are different vocations or different ministries and different roles in the church, in the life of the church. And we see the patterns of and sort of prescriptions of what are the limits and who can do what in the early church, from the scriptures themselves, the New Testament, but also in the practice of the early church beyond the scriptural descriptions, the first few centuries, right? The position of Dr. Arnecillo is that the reason why it was not practiced is it was not, it just wasn't the right time, and so Christ planted the seed that you could open the doors to more things that women can do in the church, and his foundational scripture that he was talking about, forget where, but you can look it up yourself. There are neither men nor women, Jews nor Greeks. You're probably familiar with that passage, but and so his argument was that Christ was not interested in biological sex or gender, right? And so we shouldn't be concerned with it either, and that women can and should do what historically males did in the leadership of the church. Well, the problem with that passage that I brought up was that that's talking about salvation, right? There's no male nor female, Jew nor Greek or whatever. It's salvation is open to all, right? But there's still bishops, there's still priests, there's still deacons, right? In that same time period, even after Christ. So they, the apostles must have been, must not have taken Christ's intention to heart, or maybe they didn't get it, right? If Christ intended for the ministry, the leadership in the church to be open to women, then why is Paul so restrictive in his writings, which came after Christ, right? So you'd have to really have a strong case for making the change now, 2,000 years later, if your religion or your faith, your Christian faith, is somewhat regulated by the scriptures, right? So a little bit of background, Dr. Arnecillo comes from a tradition that's a little bit more progressive in the evangelical world. The Lutheran Pietistic Movement is what it is. You could Google that on your own. And he's probably a little bit more progressive than the rest of the denomination in general, right? There's probably a little bit more left than there's a spectrum, of course, in that denomination as well. So his view would be that the scriptures are the best documents we have to know what the early church believed and taught and did and all that other stuff, but it's not necessarily a regulating a regulatory factor for how Christians need to believe and practice for today's age. It's the best we have, but it's not necessarily infallible or inerrant in every aspect of it, and maybe even all of it. You'd have to ask him. But he's also he subscribes to the ORT theology, open and relational theology. So you can look that up on your own to give you a little bit of a background sense of where he's coming from. So that said, it's not going to change for the Catholic Church as much as you want to have women's ordination. It's just not. It's not possible, because the priest offers sacrifice. It's more than being a pastor. A Protestant view of the leadership in the church. You're a pastor. You might even have a bishop, but it's more administrative. It's a preaching ministry. It's a preaching model. I mean, right? And so you have praise and worship music, maybe in an evangelical context or denomination. Then you have preaching, and then you have more evangelical, type music. That's it. There's no theology of the Mass. There's no sacrifice. There's no liturgy. All right. So that's the main distinction here. You can do whatever you want with your Protestant models, because your view is very different from the Roman Catholic or Orthodox model of church, because you have a sacrificial theology behind the Mass. What's going on at Mass is not just preaching. It's you're offering the sacrifice of Christ on the cross on the altar at every single Mass or divine liturgy. And we know from the book of Hebrews, it says that all priests are appointed are taken from men to offer sacrifice. Right? Men have always been the ones offering sacrifice. And so that tradition continues to this day, because the priest is in persona Christi, is an alter Christus, another Christ in the person of Christ, and he is offering up the sacrifices of the people and the sacrifice of Christ on the cross on the altar for his own behalf, for his own sins, and atonement for his own sins, the priest's own sins, and the sins of the people, right? And so since he is representing Christ, who is male and masculine, and he is also seen as the bridegroom, if he's the bridegroom, then who's the bride? The bride is the church. The church is feminine, and the church is the rest of us, right? And so you have that symbolism there, where you couldn't have a woman representing Christ in that priestly manner, right? So you debate all you want. Even Francis has rejected the idea of women's ordination. As liberal as Francis is, as late as 2022, he was interviewed by America Magazine, where he said it's not in his power to make that change, that the Petrine ministry is his ministry, and then there is the Marian ministry, which is the feminine vocation and ministry in the church, and it's a very important ministry in the church. Mary is seen as, it's not like Mary is second-class citizen. She is the Queen of Heaven. She is the Immaculate Conception. So there is definitely a high view of Mary and her femininity in the eyes of the church. So it's not, don't ever listen or ever get bamboozled by the ideas that the church is, because they're not ordained women, that it is still and continues to be a sexist church. It is not. It just doesn't see itself as having the power to make a change that has been tried and true since the time of Christ. So God bless you. Until next time. Bye.